if I may, I will start with some questions and remarks, maybe. So what you showed us is actually like it go beyond what observatory does, because it's not only observation, but it's really experimentation, and then you have to choose project based on the interest of running the experiment and not only getting the data, right? So I mean, in the sense that in an observatory perspective, you put the telescope towards one direction of the sky and you get the data, but you don't do actual experiment. Whereas, I mean, part of it. But I mean, I'm a little bit caricaturing just to have your comment. But then, in your case, it's more like high particle energy physics. You ask people to come up with an experiment and design an experiment. So on which basis are you selecting the project? So do they provide like preliminary data, or is it only based on theory and literature?
It's a really good question. I don't think we have the final answer to this. We're going to explore a little bit, and we've only seen 33 proposals so far. And I'm hoping next year we'll open it up furthermore. It's purely based on science. The process is blinded, so when we select a proposal, we don't see an identity of the people. And we ask the reviewers, can you rank the impact of that work? Yeah, it's based on the impact. And wherever we think, and another aspect is we care about feasibility and the practicality of the experiment, because we can't do all the kind of experiment that you all do in your lab, right? We are a pipeline. There are things we can't change, but we can't change everything. And so not all experiments are amenable to an observatory. Some of them, and we provide guidance in the document that we provided, or what would be the change you could do. But we do in the review process, we do check for feasibility and wherever we think the experiment is a workout. Another aspect I care about is, you know, when I've done it myself, so when you design an experiment, sometimes you don't really know what you're going to get. And I think observatory are going to probably avoid too much of this experiment, because this is exploratory research. I think it's the domain of academic research, whereas we should have, I think, strong hypothesis-driven question coming to like an expensive resource such as us. But you know, that might change. We'll see.
There's one question in the back and one on here. So maybe here first.
I just have a question concerning when you give the data to the other groups. Did you have view after on the analysis, or you let all the stuff to the group and the ALN is not associated anymore to the analysis for the future conclusion?
So our selection process also included, so the team that write a proposal has to include an analysis plan, and we expect to be really detailed, because we have data, but on the website that you can test your analysis on first. And so I think we were biased to select proposals that already had a really sharp, clear analysis plan. It's really the team ownership to execute that analysis plan. We will help them if they need, but that's their role. So it's really trying to, and that's why I said, I think what I like about this model is it clearly set what is the role of each group. And the ownership of the project is clearly the team that proposed the idea. This is their idea, and we should make our best to make it shine, but this is their idea.
Thank you very much for the great work. I'm wondering, how do you see the future? Are we going to have this in every country or in every institute? How are we going to scale up this way of doing research? And maybe that's also a question for Stanley. I mean, can you have this in every institute at some point, or how are we going to proceed?
I don't see the future first. I think this is an experiment. If this is an experiment, right? In our field, we're trying it out. I think the question first is this successful? I think everyone could replicate that. It depends on the effort. I don't see why not. I mean, you could have an observatory for fMRI and another, but like Neurospin is nearly that, right? I think we should just try different options. I think it's very complementary to the traditional model. I don't think they exclude one another. I'm trying to sort of say this every time. Like, it doesn't replace the experimentalist. I think it's just a way to sort of democratize the tool, like give them to everyone. And this is one of the tools. I see what I'm hoping, and the reason I'm giving talks around is I'm hoping that to convince you that we should do more of these observatory. We should build several of these. Maybe we need one on the west and east coast, and they're slightly different. And maybe the IBL is one of these. And I think it really helps the field moving forward. But I think it's up to us to decide what the future is. Maybe you have.
Yeah, I replace that in the context of externalization of part of your research to third parties. It's a big question. Can be things like that. And that was really a key question why we set up this neuroinformatics things here at the ICM is at some point we could have imagined to build the facilities where this facility will internalize any data management and analytics activities for the teams. And the teams will just send the data and then we'll take care of this and send back the result to them. And that's clearly not the framework we choose. Main reason is that, I mean, there are several reasons for that. First, the expertise usually is within the team. And if you want to do a good research, good analysis of your data, you need to understand the research questions. So you need to do that as close as possible to the PI, to the researcher that asks the questions. So we have a very porous system. So I want the people in these neuroinformatics core facilities to be driven by the research, to be in contact, working hand in hand with the research and the teams, and I want the teams to hire more computer scientists, more engineers, more data scientists, more statisticians to increase their level of expertise and knowledge in all these fields. And I think that's the only way we can provide a good service and we can do better science. I'm very doubtful of the model where you just externalize a key expertise of your research outside of your team, of your lab.
I have a question here. It's more of a scientific question for Jérôme, if I may ask. What is the hypothesis behind seeing the sequence surprise signal in layer 5? I guess you see it specifically in layer 5 and not in layer 2, 3. Is it right?
That'll be a longer conversation. So the creative assignment problem is to understand how the value of a stimulus is distributed across the network. And the team in the machine learning group have been building models and different kind of deep learning models and other that solve that issue. And what they wanted to do is to create a stimulus that sort of force the system to learn and solve that problem. And so they created a visual stimulus where you actually invoke that learning. And then they wanted to characterize what are the different components of the network do during that learning process. The dendrites, the somas, the different layers. And I think the analysis is still preliminary a little bit, but I invite you to contact Blake Richard if you want to know more about it. And Jules Zitterberg and all the others.
Yes, hi. So here on the left, or on your right? Here. So it's interesting that we have ultimately two very different ways of trying to get to the same result sitting on the round table, right? One is an institutional mandate that this is the law and everything is standardized and we come up with a way of standardization. And the other one is essentially trying to defeat a culture of non-standardization, right? And in the previous session, I think Gael and Laura did a very good job at exacerbating the dangers of not, or the dangers of not curating data, right, and variability arising from data analysis, but as an experimentalist, I would say that at least half of the variability that we have in data comes from the experimentation, right? And this is something that the Alan has been extremely good at addressing. So the general question is, how do we combine both, right? So what can we do essentially to try to address both issues at once? And it's kind of an impossible question, and I'm sorry. But
So you want to combine data standardization and the freedom to explore, is what you mean, or?
well, not necessarily, right? So one is standardizing experimental conditions, right? And that's important.
Yes.
And I think we all agree that that's important. And the second one would be along the lines of what Gail said and what Stanley is trying to do, to also try and standardize at least routine analysis, right? Or code reusability, right? And once everything is in a format, right, intuitively, you can do whatever you want with the data, right? And the freedom comes from there. And essentially, that's more or less what you just described, Jérôme, right? But again, you're in an institution in which this is part of the doctrine. How can you do it elsewhere?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're doing the same thing as you're doing in your own lab, and we just document it maybe a little more thoroughly because we have to train everyone to do it the same. But you could ask us all of our documentation and follow the same procedure. You can ask us for the CAD drawings and we'll give it to you. So I don't see to exclude one another. I do think that as a field we should get together and think hard about how we're doing this experiment, and so that people can reproduce them. The advantage of having observatories like this is we have shown robust methods to perform these experiments, and so I think we should leverage that learning and share it extensively so that people can do the same. But I really don't think it's exclude one another. The reason why we want to open it up is that if you have a result that is really important and you disagree with our findings, you can just submit it to us and we'll test. It's a way to collaborate. I don't know if I answer your question really, really well.
Just to follow up on this, how do you evaluate the success of it? I mean, I guess you said it's an experiment in itself. So, as an experiment, you want the results and you want to assess how performative it is. And I assume the question is the same at the level of the Neuroinformatics Center. We have incentive to assess the results and the efficiency of the process. So, how do you address this issue at the
as I said, assessing the return on investment, because for the board, for the funders, it's a return on investment, and this thing is impossible. I mean, by nature. So, I mean, you can be pragmatic. If the scientist within your organization thinks it's a good thing, and they could not do the same research without it, then at some point, if you have smart people on the board, they will fund that.
I mean, for observatory, I mean, I can only relate. So we had the people from the Keck come to the island, and we asked them, why do we do that? Hilton Lewis is really, really nice person. And they do this thing, so they plot the number of papers that gets out, they quantify how long it takes for a paper to get out from the observatory. I think they look at the number of proposals that we get. This is like standard metrics that we use in business. Well, like we have not much except the number of proposals at this point and how much analysis has been done. Really early.
So I had a question in common that almost goes in the same direction than the previous one, so it's interesting. So we've seen two very different models, and we've seen the kind of consequences. So of course ICM is still early on in the thought process, but it's basically, ICM is basically bottom governed, at least in terms of data acquisition, versus Allen Brain Institute, which is slightly more top governed, and also very much oriented to the external world. And so my question is, and you mentioned it in your talk, Stanley, it's a change management problem. Astronomy has probably gone into this field. Even it wasn't in astronomy 30 years ago. It was probably everybody staring at the sky with their own telescope. How do we go from astronomy at ICM, at standard places where there isn't somebody making the decision with his own personal money? How do we go from one to the other?
I mean, nobody has the answer for that question, of course, and we need to be pragmatic, and we need to go forward. I mean, I think the vision is clear, the objective is clear, what we can get at the end is clear. Now is a way to find a path which is acceptable for everybody, and that lead to that objectives. And of course, we need a bit of bottom up and top down. And of course, at some point, I mean, for instance, for the governance of the data, like, of course, we'll try to make a consensus. We'll work with all the scientists to see what is acceptable, what is their feelings. But at the end, that will be an institutional decision. So there is I mean, you need to be at the middle of a top-down and bottom-up approaches. It cannot be fully bottom-up, otherwise you might end up with not enabling anything. And top-down, I think, when you in a change management, is not the right approach either. So I think the key is the people at the end. It's just the way, if you have smart people that can explain, people that can hear, the good managers. I mean, you manage to change things. That, I mean, for me, the key is more the people than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I agree on the people. I think it's why I started with the illustration, because I think it's a collective model. Like, everybody has to believe that this can work for this to work, because everybody's part of a collaborative observatory, and so you just have to make people believe in it. And so the idea, that's why we took the idea from the astronomy. It's very poetic. I think it's evocative. Like, we would make wants people to participate.
To follow up, would you think feasible to have local observatories, like in an institute, say, we give resources to a project and people put their project, I mean, they don't do the data acquisition themselves, or the institute provide the resources to do the acquisition, but with high standards of data. So let's say we record 100 patients, 100 mice, whatever your question, but at the level of an institute, and then have a marketplace for ideas from researchers of all the institute, or maybe even outside. Would you think something like that feasible, Stanley or Jérôme?
Yeah, you could do that anywhere. It depends on the scale. I mean, obviously it depends on the scale, but you could do that anywhere. There are groups in US that are doing very similar things. That they built behavior clusters that any sort of postdoc in the lab can access, and so you can do that anywhere. The new component here is really the marketplace. Like, you really put the ideas against each other, which I think incentivizes the good science. But it depends what's the bandwidth, how many we need.
So, of course, you can do it if you wish. The question is why you would do it. And again, come back to this, where do you put the expertise in a research team? What is the purpose of a researcher? Then in this new environment of new way of doing research, we externalize a key aspect of your work. I mean, there is no definite answer to that question, but that should be, I think, assessed before implementing such a strategy. And also a comment is that I fully concur with that we need more reproducible methods and methodologies and data acquisition, management, analytics. Definitely yes, but also a lot of discovery is a bit done by mistakes. So everything standardized and everything where you have very little freedom in the way you design your experiment is there still a place for serendipity and for exploratory analysis? So we should also be careful of that.
Yep. Okay. Thanks. Thanks very much. I really love the observatory metaphor, because yes, there is some expertise, but acquiring data, analyzing data are two different expertise. And also I think it's against the bias of like the experimenter had the question and he wants to answer this question, so there is a huge bias in acquiring data. And the question I had is, not now, but in the future, like the vision of ICM, is it to share data within the ICM collaborators, or is it to build a new observatory for human by not just sharing within ICM, but opening data to everybody?
So this question has not been fully addressed yet, so I have not a definite answer. The way we probably do it is to have a different level of openness, with first trying to enforce sharing data among ourselves, and that is its first step, and then to open it to the world. And I believe you will have. It will depend on the projects. It will depend on the data. Depend on many circumstances. For instance, I applied for a big project to acquire clinical data, and we will make a commitment to release this data through the Health Data Hub, which is a national initiative for promoting open data in France. So that would be one example of one project that where, from prospective data, we very quickly release it to the public. And that as a way to show also our colleagues that this does not hurt, and that we will still, I believe, publish good papers with this data, and that will even open it to the world, will also increase the interest in our publication and our studies, I believe so. So that for on some specific cases, I think we will promote and will manage to open data to the world. But that will be go progressively.